Hello, everybody. I am Schmidt from Rocket Lasso. And over at Rocket Lasso, we make plugins and we make tutorials and we do live streams. We're actually in the middle of Rocket Lasso Live Season 5, where every Wednesday I take questions live from the audience where we just try and figure it out straight from Twitch, straight from YouTube, just answer everything in Cinema 4D that we possibly can. And if you want to follow Rocket Lasso, probably one of the best places is just search for Rocket Lasso at YouTube. That's where we post all the live streams. That's where I do breakdown videos about the new features inside of Cinema 4D all the time. We just had 2023.2 come out, and I made a 2-hour video about all those features, so super crazy. Also, you can just search at Rocket Lasso on all the different platforms. And then, of course, I've got a Patreon set up where if I scheduled it correctly, all the scene files I'm about to show off are already live on there. So a great way of supporting, getting discounts on the plugins and getting access to scene files. You can head over and support on Patreon. Now, something I want to mention today, which is very important, is we've got 5 different plugins over at Rocket Lasso. So we got Utility Splines, which recently came out. We've got Ricochet, Mesh the Spline, Slicer, and Recall. Today, we are going to be talking about folding, cloth, paper, and origami. I am very excited about this because during my live streams, it has been a very common question. Every year, somebody says, how do I fold this origami? How do we do this shape? And it's always like, well, let's try, but we are never able to quite get it where we wanted to. So a couple weeks ago, during a live stream, that question got asked again. It's like, well, we've got an all-new simulation system. Let's see if we can get it working this time. And we totally did, and it was awesome, and I was very excited. So, how do we go about folding paper, napkins, origami, and why do it at all? Why do we need to fold it? Well, I've got a very basic setup here. Here's just like a plane. You can see it's a heavily subdivided plane. And then I've also got a final origami bird, very subdivided, the same kind of subdivision. So if I grab this morph tag and morph between those two states, let's say you have a sheet of paper and you want to, in your animation, fold it up. Well, if I go and morph between those two states, let me actually show the proper one. If we morph between those two states, you're going to see it just passes right through itself. You're just getting this big mess where, yeah, you get to the final shape, but it's not getting there in an interesting way. So that's what this presentation is all about. So let's move on into this file. Now, this is actually the file that we were doing during the live stream where we figured out that things started to work. So let's look at some super duper basics. So let's even delete these out. And we've got a ground plane. And even here, I think it's like this is big giant, if I were to make a figure, you can see that this is not properly scaled. So we're just tinkering at a big giant scale. But if we grab the ground and we add a simulation tag, and this has only been the last couple of versions of Cinema, we can add a new collider. And on this plane for our cloth, I can say simulation cloth. And without even changing anything else, I've got a big plane that I'm going to animate just to tell it to flip over. So if I hit play here, then we're going to see, give it a second to initialize. So you can see that, let's make this visible, I have just a simple plane, and I am keyframing that plane to just flip over, and it's bringing the cloth with it. So if I hit play, you can see that this is going to flop that one piece over, and then we get a really nice looking fold. As soon as we got that during the live stream, I was like, hey, there's potential here. We might be able to get this working way more than that. So if we keep on layering that up more and more and more, I'm going to jump to the next file. You can see now I've got several of those planes, each one kind of keyframed and offset. We're going to get specific in a moment. But if I play right now, you can see I've got that same piece of cloth where we can fold it over again, fold it over again, and all this at pretty much default settings. And you can see I was able to fold that over a bunch of times, and it's working really well. So I was very excited at this point for all of the possibilities. Now, that shows a little bit about the ability that this new cloth simulation system can actually handle folding itself over and getting some pretty sharp looks. But let's jump into a file and talk a little bit about the mix animation. So what do I got here? I got a simple plane. You can see it's decently subdivided. And I've got a twist deformer. If I hit play, you're going to see our twist deformer is going to do a really straightforward twist, just keyframed along the line. Now, this is cool. It's what you expect from Cinema 4D. But let's say that this was a piece of cloth, that this is like a rag that you want to be crumpling up, and it's like a towel that you're twisting around. Obviously, this isn't even close to that at all. And everything we just did with this twist, like it's stretching, everything, it's not working at all the way we'd want it to. But if I go and right-click on that plane and add a new simulation cloth tag, and if I play right now, not too much is going to happen because it's just a simulation. I turned gravity off, so all default simulation. But if we go, and EJ was touching upon this in the previous presentation, we can go into mix animation, and this is pretty new as of maybe like 6 months ago. So we got two ways of actually controlling the way the simulation runs. And I've always thought that like simulation stuff is fun, but it's the ability to like blend it with like keyframed animation. That's what actually turns into a motion graphics tool. So we've got 3 different settings, and we will be using all 3 in different ways. The first one is with pins. So I'm going to turn that one on, and we're going to lower the power way down to like 15%. What is with pins doing? With pins, what it's trying to do is say, at any given moment, any point is trying to achieve, it's running a simulation, but it's trying to achieve what the underlying animation was doing, and it's trying to very directly move into that position. So I have found that between 15 and 30% has been working really well for this level of subdivision. So if I hit play right now, you remember the way the animation looked without it, but now if I hit play, you can see it's twisting around, not perfectly matching it, but just by doing that simple twist animation, I've got like this perfect rag like twisting around. So that was very little effort, 2 keyframes, and I've got this complex looking animation. So that's going to be one of the big takeaways here is you can do really quick and dirty animations and then run the simulation on top of it, making everything be a consistent size, making it art directable, and being able to create so many new opportunities that we just never had before. And that's why I think there's going to be a lot of different simulation presentations in today and at the Maxon booth during all of NAB, because there are so many cool new possibilities that we're only just now discovering, even though we've had access to some of the stuff for like over a year. So that is playing around with pins. We can also say, hey, that can crank up. Like I said, we can go up to 30%, or let's go to 30% there. Hit play, and you can see way more. It's sticking very closely to what that twist was doing. But then you can go really weak with it, drop that down to 5, rewind, and I can see just barely is it trying to catch up to it. And eventually it wasn't even able to get all the way around, so it just directly collides with it. We can then change this. Instead of using pins, we can say, let's do this with a force instead. Now, the differences between with pins and with force, I think for most people, artistically speaking, there's not that much of a difference. Like I said, the pins are directly trying to pull a point from one spot to another. What with force is doing is it's almost like there's a little wind blowing just on that one point, and it's trying to blow it into the position. So there's a little bit more of a follow through and a flow with it. So I think that this one can give you a little bit more organic look with things. The default strength of 1 actually works really well. If I hit play on that, you're going to see it's going to follow quite nicely. Twisting around. I mean, you see it's a little more organic. It's not forcing it to those positions quite so much. And all of this is with our default cloth settings. If we were to jump into our surface and say, hey, you're actually able to be very bendy, and maybe you can stretch a little bit if you need to, it's going to dramatically change what that final shape is going to look like, combining that with so many different things. But we've got a lot to cover, so let's move on to our next file. And that is just some of the basics. Now, I've got a properly scaled scene here, where you're going to see I've got this figure. I've found myself very often creating a figure just to constantly remind myself, like, work at the proper scene scale, especially when you're doing a simulation. If you start playing with a giant piece of cloth, and then you run all your simulations, and suddenly like, oh wait, the actual final scene's really tiny, like all your simulation settings aren't going to be matching anymore. So in this case, we're starting pretty small. I got a table, which is just 60 by 60, and we got a piece of cloth, which is 50 by 50. Having done that, let's right-click on the cloth and say Simulation Cloth. And we're going to need way more subdivisions here. So let's jump this up to, I don't know, let's say 50 by 50. We don't have to worry about doing custom cuts here if we're going to be folding the cloth. We don't have to, that was in the past, it was always like, oh, we got to make cut after cut in the perfect spot where it's going to be flipping. We don't have to worry about that. And simulation runs really fast, even on heavily subdivided objects. So to begin with, let's make the floor something we can collide with. So that'll become a simulation collider. And I think if we hit play right now, it should just kind of, you see it kind of twitch there for a split second, and then it settles onto the ground. Now, the reason that's happening is this is just barely above the ground. So the first thing I probably want to do is say, hey, cloth, you are pretty thin. Right now, the thickness is set to 1.5, but I'll drop that down to 0.1, so it's very thin. So now if I hit play, you can see that, okay, it just settled nicely, gently on the ground. You know what, I might actually subdivide this even more. Back to the original cloth. And we'll drop that to 60 by 60. Okay, so what are the basics of getting the cloth to be art directable and foldable? Well, the first thing is we don't need to use a cloth right away. A trick I've been doing is, yeah, you can click on cloth and you say basics, don't enable, we can turn off enable, but what's a little bit faster is I just make a null and I can just pull it off the null, so I can pull it on, pull it off, pull it on. So let's just make a very simple deformer. So here's a bend deformer. I'll drop that as a child of this piece of cloth. Say I want it to be facing on Z+. Click fit to parent, and instantly it's going to perfectly scale to be matching the entire shape. If I increase the strength a little bit and we get the angle the correct direction, which I think will be -90 in this case, you can see that this is bending upward quite nicely. So what do we want to do? Well, I think I would like to bend this, just have the piece of paper fold over once. So that will be going from 0 strength, keyframe that, and I'm going to say about 30 frames later. With all the stuff, you've got to give the simulation a little bit of time to complete. So I have found that about 1 second is plenty of time for it to look nice. You could go way slower, you could go faster if you crank up like your sub-steps, but we're going to stick with 30. So at 30 frames, I'm going to increase this all the way up to, let's just do a nice clean 180. So that's what it looks like at 180, but if we take our X, Y parameter here, I can start shrinking that down and the bend becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually we get this really, infinitely tight fold. It's folded directly on top of itself. Now this is the type of thing we would have done in the past. If you're trying to fold, you get this piece of paper or cloth folding in on itself. It's just intersecting. It doesn't look any good. And so trying to add a little bit of thickness to it, if you had like one, it just never quite worked. You don't have enough subdivisions. But let's just go ahead and say, hey, you are fully folded over. Now, all I have to do, we've got those keyframed. If I rewind, we can see, in the scrubbable kind of real time, we can see that that thing is going to bend over and fall on top of itself. But now, let's pull that default simulation tag, drop that back on top of it, go into our mix animation and say, hey, I would like to have you follow that animation. And let's start with, I'm going to go to 20% and hit play, and let's see what we get. Now, you see that it flopped over on top of itself. And there's even kind of some wrinkles going there. If I play, you can see, boom, folds over really nice and quickly. Hit NA. You see this folds over. Now, depending on the influence, if we put this lower, if I say only 10%, very weakly is it trying to achieve that position. So if I play, you're going to see it's going to struggle to move at all. Let's increase that back up to 15. Reset, and you see that's enough for it to kind of fold over, but it's kind of fighting itself. If I go up to, like I said, between 15 and 30, if I say 30% and we do it, you're going to see very mechanically it followed it. But in spite of very mechanically following it, we're going to see that there is a little bit of space here. But let's keep on pushing this further. So that's one fold, that's working fine. But let's say that I would like, I'm going to pull that bend off, or pull the cloth tag off, grab the bend, and say, actually, I want you to bend at a 45-degree angle. So I'm going to rotate that 45, and if we scrub, we can see, okay, now we're bending on that angle. Right away, let's make a second bend. All I need to do is select its 2 keyframes, and I'll offset them by 30 frames, so immediately the next one will go. And let's even scrub a little bit into this animation and say, where do we want the second bend to be? And I can just spin this to a new angle. So I'll spin it, let's do 90 degrees from where I was, and you can see I get a second bend. So now we're folding one triangle, a second triangle, and just because it's working very well here, let's make a third one. And all we have to do, again, offset. This time, I'll spin it just 45 degrees. I'm pretty confident that will work. And you know what? Why don't we even just immediately go for a fourth bend? Oop, let's make sure I duplicate that first. And offset the keyframes one more time. Scrub to that time. And where do I want this last bend to be? Well, this time, I probably want to rotate 45 again. But this time, let's scoot it over until we're kind of dead center. Now, what's great here is you see I'm like art directing this. I'm able to say it should happen at this time, at this position. Let's move the cut to this particular spot. There's no simulation going on. I don't need to worry about like checking the simulation again and again, seeing if the timing's working. I can now rewind, hit play. Here's just the keyframed bend. Now it's it's working well, but of course it's just completely intersecting itself. But now that we've got that bit of animation going, let's drag our cloth tag back on again, and then hit play, and now we can see it fold over, and now look at this nice bend that we have here. Hit play, let it keep going, nice fold, another fold, another fold. So looking pretty good, but something to notice is this is now going to be sneaking through the ground a little bit. A couple different things we can do to work around that. First of all, you go to your simulation settings, so Control D, click Simulation, and we've got things like our sub-steps. It's pretty often that I will take this and crank this up to, say, 50 sub-steps. I find that works pretty well. Another good setting is your collision passes, which sometimes I'll crank up to 5. Those feel pretty good to me. But even just cranking this up to 50, if I play again, it's going to be better, but it's not going to be perfect. So you see we get a fold. It does look better. Look at this nice fold layering up on top of each other. There we go, layered up nicely. But as these layers kind of crush on top of each other, you're going to again see they're sneaking through the ground. Now, a major variable on this is the simulation system inside of Cinema now is particle-based. And this ground plane is not very heavily subdivided. So we should say, hey, there's actually more particles that are stopping you from passing through. So let's select the floor and crank up its point count. So I'll jump that also up to 60 by 60. So just making that change, not changing our simulation settings this time. Let's hit play, and now you see we get a fold, another fold, a third fold, and all that from those simple keyframes. And let that one fall over. And now just having changed the subdivisions on that plane, you're going to see that that is passing through significantly less. Pushing that further, we could subdivide the floor even further. Something that's actually kind of surprising is subdividing your meshes here doesn't slow down the simulation too much, because Cinema's having to be like, oh, I'm going to interpret your points and figure out what those subdivisions should have been. Now we're saying, well, I'm telling you where they should be. So we can crank that up. We can go back to our simulation settings and give that a few extra collision passes, and that should significantly help from that falling through the ground. So layer that up, and now we're seeing these lovely folds go across, and there we go. So very pleased with that. We can keep on playing a lot with these settings, though. These are all set to defaults. One of the reasons that this is fighting so much is I am telling it that you've got all these layers, and you want to be very precisely here. The pins are trying to force all these individual layers, and it's pushing it down through the ground. If instead I say, you know what, and there's a very sharp bend, these obviously we're feeding a very sharp bend, but I can say, hey, I'm telling you right now, you're not very bendy. I can say, no, wait, you're a piece of cloth. Like, you can be very, very bendy. So I'm going to type in a pretty big number. Like, we can go, well, 55 tends to be a good number for things. Like, always jump up to, with simulations, 55 is a good go-to. But if I'm going to say, hey, I just want this to be super duper bendy, 555, I find is just a great number for getting that to bend however it wants. And I'm also going to put in a little bit of stretchiness of 55. So just changing those two, we're now saying that it's more free to bend, and now you can see that these corners will be a little bit sharper, and they're more free to not be forcing each other through the ground. So we get some nice layering up there. Yeah, you see how much crisper all those layers are. So that's looking good, and now if we look below the ground, it's not sneaking through at all. So you got to keep in mind that you've got all these particles, and they're fighting each other. So if you're really strongly telling something to go through the floor, then it's going to be like, well, I'm trying, but there's a floor in the way. Now it's like, hey, you're a little more bendy. You don't have to force your way through the floor. Having done that, a couple things, like let's make this a little bit more, right now it's a very thin piece of cloth. I got it set to 0.1. Even right now, without rewinding, I'd say, actually, you're 0.2 instead. If I have play, you're going to see suddenly the entire thing tries to inflate, and it's like, oh, it's a thicker piece of cloth. I can jump this up to 0.5, and it's going to be self-intersecting a bit, but hit play, and again, you're going to see it's going to inflate, and now it's a thicker piece of cloth. Rewinding, back to the beginning, let's let it properly fold into that position, and you see there's a lot of cloth, and you can see now you can actually see a little bit of a gap in there as these fold on top of each other. And again, looking really great. We can go back to that original animation, and that was so easy to put together. We can change it at any moment. So in this case, some of you have probably noticed that we're getting these really sharp triangles here. Now, technically, you can feed any kind of mesh that you want through here. A common thing I would do in testing was, well, those angles are really sharp because we need, maybe we need a different type of mesh here. So doing something like pulling in a poke polygon, so hitting Shift-C to pull up the commander. The commander in 2023.2 now has the ability to search through the capsules as well. So I can search for poke polygons. I can drag that in. Why is that grayed out? That's strange. Shift-C, poke. I have no idea why that's grayed out. Axis. Okay, interesting. Well, we can get around that for now by dropping. I'm going to drop my point count down, make that editable, and select all my polygons. Right click, and actually, let me hit Shift-C, search for the word poke again, and there's the modeling. Oh, interesting. 0.2. Well, anyway, you can now see I've subdivided these into these little triangles. Okay, well, there's more angles to bend from, and the simulation will continue to work. So if I have play, we can see that it's going to bend just fine. But the problem I find is now that this is a mesh made out of triangles, like, yeah, we get these nice crisp edges here, but once you put in a subdivision surface, it just never looks as nice. You get some really strange looking geometry, which makes perfect sense. But if I take that and throw that into a subdivision surface, you can see, okay, we get these, this really interesting pattern, but hitting NA, you can see that we get these little pinches happening, and there's no good way around that. So it just goes, in general, modeling, you want there to be quads. So let's rewind. bring back this original mesh. And is there anything else I want to cover? Well, as a general rule, keep in mind that like this is all about you can make a really rough animation and be able to tweak it later. So right now, pulling off that cloth tag again, I can scrub to whatever part I want. Let's say, okay, we're bending right there. I can grab this bend and say, actually, I want that to bend like that, and we'll grab this one. I'll just randomly bend it to a slightly different angle. Got to get it correct angle there. Yeah, pull that through. Grab this one, say that this one will bend a little bit differently from there. So now, if I just manually let that fold, you see I got this really wacky looking fold I was able to change in real time. So, not super coherent, but I was able to update that, change it to a weird looking shape. Let's grab our floor, T for scale it up a bit, scoot it over. So now we're making sure it's colliding. So just by updating that, put our cloth tag back on again, hit play, all those will fold over into that new shape. Like it's that easy to go and update it. But I would like to quickly address like these sharp triangles that we're getting. What's great about all of the simulation stuff is it's behaving like a deformer. It's very non-destructive. So what I've been doing is that we can take this cloth and feed it into something like a connect object. I don't need to weld it, but now it's like we're seeing the final resulting geometry of whatever happened with the simulation. So if I were to make now a single smoothing deformer, I'll drop this inside. You see it's smoothing out a whole bunch, but I've found it works perfectly if we just do zero stiffness and a single iteration. So I can rearrange the order here a little bit, and you can see that we got those really sharp triangles. A single smoothing iteration is pulling those way back into something that's very visually reasonable. Drop that now inside of the simulation surface, or subdivision surface, and now you get nice and rounded, and those triangles are completely gone. I mean, even without the smoothing, it's going to look pretty good in subdivision surface, but you can see that just completely eliminates them. And then we've got the amazing new thicken generator. So if I take this final result and throw it into this thicken, now we can check our cloth, and we said the cloth should be 0.5 thick. So I'll just say, okay, thicken. You are also going to be set to 0.5. So now we've got cloth with thickness that's not intersecting, that we are able to art direct just by feeding through a series of simple deformers. In this case, just a bunch of bends. So we've got a bunch of subdivision stuff happening. So this might run a little bit slower. I'll drop this to 1 by 1. But let's hit play, check out what the result of that is. And yeah, look at this cloth running in real time that we can go and modify any of those elements, have it fold however we want. So that's where the power of some of this new simulation comes in. And that's just using a very simple mix animation. Stylistically speaking, let me close this file and, oh wait, no, I want to keep that one. Keeping this file, I could say, you know what, this influence is way less. So only 15% with the pins. So it was very coherent, but but now we can find a nice number where it's just enough to bend. Let's see if that's enough. Yeah, you see now it's kind of flopping over more. Or if I jump this number up to something like 40%, it's going to be very mechanically stuck in a spot. You see, very precise. So let's turn off pins and instead say, let's do it with this force parameter. So like I said, this is more like a wind blowing on the different points. Having done that, if we hit play, now the wind is blowing on it. Not quite enough. You see, the wind isn't overcoming gravity, so let's jump this up to 3, maybe. Hit play. And there we go. Okay, that's enough. And I feel like this force is definitely a little bit more organic even on top of that. So depending on how much wind, now we could crank this up. You could use the two of them in combination with each other. If we jump this up to something like 10, it's going to be a very strong wind. And again, it's going to become a little bit mechanical. And you can combine the two. So I could say, okay, well, give me like a little bit of this wind force and a little bit of those pins, and they can combine in all sorts of ways. So you can be very playful with that, but I like the little bit more organic look of things we get when we just barely give it enough of a value to get to the position that we want it to be. Let's let that fold. Still not quite enough. Find that correct balance. Now this might be a little bit dependent on your subdivisions. If you're very subdivided, that might be different, but there we go. Nice transition between the two. Okay, excellent. Very pleased with that. Let's jump on into the next file. And what I want to do here is fold something a little bit more precisely. I want to make something specific. So I think we go here. So what I was doing is I was just searching for different napkin types. So I just Googled different napkins, and I found this fold right here. And this one seemed relatively straightforward. And I used to be a waiter at a country club, and I've literally folded thousands of this type of napkin. So that is what the goal is here. So let's go through pretty quickly. We don't need to visually see those. Those aren't relevant right now. So using just things we already talked about, here is our piece of cloth. Here is the cloth applied to it. And you can see all the settings pretty much that we just set up for ourselves. I've got one bend and a second bend and a third bend. let's just see what those are doing. So we've still got the cloth turned on. So continuing pretty much from where we were, we can now see that this corner is folding over. And then simultaneously, I've got two different bends that, if I select them, you can see we've just got a bend right there doing the exact same thing we just were, but both at the same time, you see, with the cloth, those fold over very nicely and precisely on top of each other, perfectly layered up. But you have I was doing this all very mechanically, but you can be art directing this stuff. If we rewind and let's, again, pull the cloth tag off, if I grab this first bend, you're going to see that this is doing something a little bit fancier than what we had earlier. Hitting NA, you can see that I've got this very small bend, but hitting play, you can see that instead of me just keeping it in that one final position, I'm actually keyframing the position of this bend so it travels from a start point to an end point. So instead of just getting a very simple fold, you can see that it's actually moving across the shape. I'm able to art direct exactly where those positions are. Let's even add a little more in precision. Let's say at the end, in this case, frames in, let's modify that rotation so we do end up in the proper spot. But earlier on, let's say we just want it to look a little bit more imperfect, so we'll add a little rotation onto that, keyframe that rotation. So now as the bend comes in, you see it's at an angle, but then eventually it will get to that final position. I've got these two folds coming in, but we could say one of them is going to happen a few frames earlier, perhaps even overlapping the previous animation, so now they don't reach the end point at exactly the same time. So again, not even worrying about simulation. We can be very precise and art direct this, like go into your F curves, get the easing in, the easing out, everything exactly where you want it to be. Okay, moving on, we've got another step we need to do. If we look at the napkin, there's actually a step here where this fold happens, but then you have to flip the entire thing upside down. It's like, okay, well, how are we going to flip this piece of cloth upside down? Well, let's just make another bend that's set up to flip it. And this is without the simulation. So here's just another bend. Simple keyframes. You can see what this bend is doing. That completes. And now I've got a large bend. And you see, I actually have it keyframed with a significant Y length. We have a radius on it. So as I let that scrub across, you can see it starts out very large. You see the smooth curve I'm letting it animate to? And then as we get near the end, it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And eventually, we flip the entire thing over 180 degrees just by passing a bend straight through the entire thing. So now that flip has happened, we take a look at our next bend. Let's just turn that one on. This next bend, and again, I followed these instructions. That one, as I scrub through, is going to flip that entire piece over. And then we've got a complex movement that we need. Eventually, the napkin is supposed to end up like this. So we're going to do that with 3 different bends. Let me turn, and again, I've always been critical of people just like keyframing characters and stuff with bends, but suddenly bends are like my new favorite thing for doing this cloth technique. So I'm going to make 3 new bends, and I'm going to go a little bit quick. Thank you, Adobe. A little bit quick on here because we got a lot to cover. You'll see I actually have 3 different bends. Let me turn that third one off to show you. So what's actually happening is I want these 2 wings to fold down simultaneously. So they're actually folding down into the ground. So, nice simple fold. Two bends happen at the same time. Same thing we've been seeing over and over again. But the final shape now is underground. And of course, it's going to be trying to achieve that position. So instead, I just made another third bend. I said, okay, but from way over here, bend all the geometry upward. And I stop at a particular spot. So now you can see, just with a series of bends, here's what that final movement looks like. 3 different bends happening simultaneously. So awesome. All that is working very nicely. Let's throw our cloth tag back on there and see what it actually does with all that animation. So you can see that slowly transitions over from one side to the other, where now these are flapping in directly from where the bends were, but slightly offset in time. And then we have this nice, large curve, flip over, and the entire thing flips over upside down. Thank you very much, bend. And then one more flat one. And then we're going to have 3 bends simultaneously moving to achieve that final shape, which is right there. So we could keep, so you see there's a couple things going on. And what I want to show you right there is that everything we just did was the same bend techniques we were talking about in the previous example, but I placed them very precisely with some intent of what I wanted them to do. But now let's push some of the technique a little bit further. And one of my favorite things is if there's capsules inside of Cinema. A lot of people haven't played with them. I've been going around trying to tell people about all the amazing capsules that are built in. And Rocket Lasso has been developing capsules for Maxon. But there is one called Geometry Axis. And And if you search Shift-C and you just search for geometry axis, I wonder if, for some reason, it's not showing the full commander there, but I successfully have my geometry axis pulled in. So it's just a capsule. Actually, we can probably just find it manually over here. You can go to nodes and say, I would like the axis, and there it is, the geometry axis node. So you can drag that over, and we can activate that. By default, what does the geometry axis do? Well, actually, let me show you in the new scene file. We'll pop this open, create a sphere, well, create a disk and a sphere. If we grab this geometry axis and I drop it as a child, it's a deformer. It's changing points around. So what it's going to do is say, hey, I want to have all my points pivot from offset by 100% of your current bounding box. And now I've perfectly got the sphere sitting on the ground. But we can also say, hey, this is pivoting from one side or another, or you could combine several objects together and have them offset. How this is relevant to what we want to do here is, if I turn on this geometry axis, I can say, hey, I want the result of whatever the animation I'm doing to be, I want it to be offset and sitting on the ground. So before, where this was hovering, instead of keyframing and getting it perfectly there, I'm just telling the deformer, to just place it perfectly on the ground. Another thing is, let's turn off that geometry axis and scrub through. Let me pull off this cloth. If we scrub through, you're going to see that this piece of cloth is traveling all over the place. Like right here, we're starting out very nicely centered in frame, but suddenly it's way over in the left. And then when we do this flip animation, the bend is just naturally making it flip over to the opposite side. So it's kind of moving all over the place. It would be difficult to counter keyframe this to keep it maybe floating in the center of your screen. But the geometry axis can help us with that as well, where this is saying, hey, just keep it dead center right in the middle. So if I hit play, having just created geometry axis and told it to sit on Y offset there, hit play, we can now see that as this flips over, it is going to recenter itself automatically. And it flips over and it's still saying dead center automatically. And as this folds up, it's still staying dead center and staying perfectly on the table. All of that is just being done by this single capsule. So very powerful in the world of modeling. But I'm seeing another little problem that I would like to address now is the geometry axis is, it's just a deformer in this case. So you can see when this is moving across, look at this corner over here. As I hit play, that's going to very harshly hit that endpoint, just kind of stops really harshly. Now, the simulation, the cloth will help with that, but keep in mind that everything we're doing is a deformation before we run our simulation. So we can do something like create a jiggle. So let's search for jiggle, and we'll pull this in. No, it still doesn't like that. We'll just do it from the menu. Commander doesn't like me today. So grab a deformer, find the jiggle, drop this as a child. Keep in mind, everything we're doing right now is no simulation. So by default, we got some stiffness, we got a bunch of structural, we got some drag. Hitting play, we see these flip around, and you see that there's a little bit of curvature to that already. And now you can see that's wiggling around, and now it flips over, it's going to pass to the ground. But it's like, okay, it's more organic now, and it's very controllable. So let's get rid of all the structural, and I'm going to say, what I want is a lot of drag. I'm going to do like 70% drag. So very slowly, these individual points want to achieve their final position. So now, look at how smoothly, remember that corner we were focused on before? As this folds over, look how smoothly that slides into the position. So again, no keyframes, geometry axis, put a jiggle on top of that, let all those folds I manually made get fed through. Now with all those layered up together, drop the cloth back on, our simulation, hit play, and now we get the result of all that animation layered up. Look at this nice smooth movement into the center. So we can keep it focused dead center or offset however we like. So I just love our ability to layer these things together. Lovely flip there. Let it fold on top. You can see all the individual layers there with the thickness I currently have set. And then the final move, where before it was floating in the air, now you can see the entire thing pulls up and stays sitting on the ground. Now, what's funny is you could think of this in a lot of ways like a modeling technique. If I were to make this editable right now, I just have a nice napkin folded up that I could be placing and cloning onto a table if I wanted to. But the ability to get the animation and actually get this final shape is like absolutely loving it. Let's turn on that same smoothing technique, get those corners melted away, turn on the subdivision, turn on this cloth, get a little thickness on there, and you can see just perfect napkin all folded up, layered up on top of itself. Okay, we got a little bit more time. jump to the next file. This is the finished version of that file. Okay, we want to get a little bit fancier now. I wanted to push the technique and see if we could actually do some proper origami. So I searched and I found this nice origami bird. So if we scrub through, you see we got all these lovely steps. Kind of get the sailboat look, fold it over, one flap moves over, then we fold the wings. So as scrolling through, it's like, well, we got a couple challenges here. Like that, we can do that with a simple bend. We can do that with a simple bend. We're just folding it over on itself. But then here, you can see that only part of the flap is moving over. So, okay, we're going to have to get a little bit fancier, maybe make some selections this time. And then if we go down further, here's where things get tricky. Look at this movement. How are we going to be able to get this pinch happen where we like invert this beak into the rest of the bird? So I was like, okay, this is a good challenge, escalating the situation a little bit as I was trying to figure out what this presentation might be. So let's pull the cloth tag off temporarily. And again, nothing we haven't done already. We got the first 2 steps, and I was naming these steps after whatever instructions I found. So here's step 1, hit play, nice simple fold over. And then we got step 2. So now we've got this bend, and you see it's pivoting from this position. Hit play, and you see another nice fold flipping that over. Now again, what's nice here is, as I was doing the origami, my final bird wasn't looking quite right. I was like, what step was wrong? I was like, oh wait, I had this a little bit too far over. But you can see right now, I can very easily grab my bend and be like, oh, that should be over here. It should be over there. It's so easy to adjust. If I think of, you saw the original technique when I started the presentation of like, just like the planes, like flipping over, trying to move it. Like that'd be impossible to art direct and get something complex. But here we're able to do it. But anyway, we have to make the next step we're doing is going to have to be based off of this, where we only need one of these flaps to bend over. And you see it's actually kind of pivoting from the center of everything else. So if I were to activate step 5, let me make sure that's turned on. Yeah, so activate step 5, we're just, again, keyframing strength, same thing we've been doing. So as this folds through, flips, and then you'll see everything is bending. So pretty straightforward, we need to make some sort of selection to limit what points or polygons should be moving. So in this case, we can actually do things procedurally. So I've got this tag right here, but why don't we make it from scratch? So I will, actually it's layered up a couple times, but let me do an example. Right-clicking, I can say, give me an other tag. The tag I would like is a point selection. And I can say, how should that be made? Well, we could make it editable, and you could just make a selection manually, but I like using fields. So inside the fields, we could say make a linear field, and based on the threshold of this field, and here's the tolerance of 50%, if I hit T for scale down this field, we can make it really thin, and I can say, I know that fold's going to happen right there, so if we rotate that 45 degrees and scoot it into that position, I am now saying select all the points that are above that linear field and none of the ones that are below it. So having done that, I can say, okay, step 5, your field is going to be limited to this selection tag. So just by limiting what is going to be bent, we can get this fold, and now you'll see that this fold is now successfully only applying to a little bit of our geometry. So it flips down, excellent. So then we've got step 6. You see this one, these two are step 6 and step 7 are pretty straightforward. Oh, wait, nope, step 7 does have a tag. So let's see what step 7 is doing for us, or 6 rather. You see as I scrub through that it's just folding the entire bird in half. I simultaneously keyframed the cloth, so you see the whole thing is pivoting so we can get to a nice new position. And then we need to, again, do a fold. In this case, we want to flip these wings of the bird. So you can see, again, it's very limited in one spot or the other. So again, we just need to make another selection. In this case, the entire bird is going to be folded on one side or the other. So all I need to do was make another linear field. Let's rewind to the beginning. So we've got another linear field that's just saying, hey, here's a selection on one side or the other. The exact same technique again. So with that in mind, we can now activate step 7 and 8, which are going to do those folds. And you can see I made one selection. I should probably make this editable. If I double click on that tag, you see half the points were selected by my selection field. You could also do that manually. I'm obsessed with not making things editable because you never know if you want to change the subdivisions on your cloth and make it look a little smoother or make it run a little bit faster. So having done that, we can expand and let's look at what those final steps are doing for us. Oh, and what I want to say is step 7 is saying, oh, select half of those points. And then on step 8, I said, hey, you're seeing that same selection, but invert it using another field. So as I scrub through, you can see we get this final fold where both wings are flipping around to the opposite side. So now, why don't we take a look at what that looks like with a cloth on there. The only thing different here, it's all the same settings. You see we got 55, and actually made it very stretchy, but it's trying to follow it very accurately. And I turned off gravity. So now we get those folds, but with a simulation layered on top. So you get the fold, these bend over, and it flips up, and we get the final bird without any of these different sheets intersecting each other. So if we turn on that connect again, and do I have a smooth? No, I don't have a smooth this time. Well, we won't worry about that. But now this catches us up. This will catch us up to that tricky step, which is this one right here. How do we do that? Well, what's funny is when you're doing simulation stuff, how often you just want to be very literal. If we want to, essentially, well, what's happening with this beak? It's almost like this piece of paper is inverting its direction. But if we just, and there's a way that we can invert the direction there, but it might flop on one side or flop on the other. So before we do that, we probably need to have the entire thing bulge out a little bit so there's a space for it to fill. So just like we see in this image where it's kind of bulging outward, we need to achieve that. So let's do that from scratch. So I'll delete those out and we'll do it manually. So we're now at this position. Let's get rid of our simulation tag where everything's very flat. And scrub to the end. What's great, I don't have to play through because of the way we're setting up. We can just scrub right to this end. So how do we make that kind of bulge out, go both directions? Well, we're going to do that with a plane effector, strangely enough. If we make a plane effector, and I'm going to name it plane effector dot deform, because we're going to go to the deformer tab and say you're actually deforming the points. Now, immediately you're going to see this whole bird sort of exploding and inflating out. I wonder what that would look like with a simulation running. But instead of having it go super crazy far out on Y, let's zero that out. And in order to make this inflate out, we want to push it out on Z. Maybe I should show this on another object to make it a little more clear. If I open up a new file and make something simple like a sphere, paste in that same plane deformer, if we deform on Y, all the points are going to be using their local position and try and move out on their Y. But all of them, their normals, are facing out on Z. So if I increase Z, we're going to get this shape inflating outward or shrinking inward. So that's the effect that we're going for. So I want to push these out. Now, it just so happens that the bird is flipped upside down just by the nature of it, so we actually need to go negative. So if I grab the Z position, I can say -1, -2, and you can see how this is now bulging outward. Everything is, but this part is specifically. Now, it's going a little bit overboard, so let's only do 1, and we need to limit how that's being applied. So let's go to our fields, and very simply, we can say spherical field. Grab that spherical field, and I want to snap it to the proper position. So Shift S for turning on snapping. I can just drag it. You see, we'll snap to that point. Perfect. Turn off that, and now I can hit T for scale. Oop, do I have fields visually turned off? Yep. Fields, please. Okay. So we got some fields. So I've got this new spherical field, T for scale. I can start shrinking that down. And now you see as that spherical field passes through the bird, it's only applying to certain places. So now, with this being nice and small, turn off snap, move it down, T for scale, shrink it down. We're going to want some fall off on that. So go to the remapping, grab the inner offset. We can shrink this inner out to get a nice smooth transition. And now look at this nice, perfect, clean bulge that we're getting on that shape. We can go back to our plane deformer, have it push out further, and now look at this nice, clean unfolding of that particular spot. Now, what's funny is we're doing that work on this part, but it's temporary. Essentially, we want it to bulge out so we can flip it down to make the beak and then fold it back in again. So how do we get this to invert? Well, it's actually a very similar technique, and I think when it comes to folding, it's a very important technique. And essentially, from this point forward, you've seen the meat of what we're talking about. So this is more about addressing specific limitations or tricks, or you're going to see something that's going to look tricky. And there's ways we can do it by doing special deformations. So we're going to do another plane deform. Save some time. I'll just duplicate this, and no spherical field this time. And we need to do something a little bit fancier this time, and that's going to be everything so far was deforming outward based on the normal of the polygon. But I can say I want it to be absolute, like in world space, or specifically based on the space of the effector. So if the effector now is saying push backward, push forward, so everything is being pushed forward. Now I could move this effector, and I will again snap it to the beak, Shift S, snap it right there to that point, turn off snapping. So I want this to do what? Well, I want it to deform downward. So I'll hit R for rotate, and we'll spin it down. And I'm going to go straight down to begin with. And so you can see this -2 is going to push it up or down. So we want to go positive. So you can say, okay, push it down, let's say that amount right now. But everything's being pushed down. Obviously, you don't want everything pushed down, so we need to limit it again. So let's grab another field. This time it will be another linear field. That is automatically created as a child, so you'll see it's properly zeroed out in this position. T for scale, it's a little big, so shrink it down. And we need the proper orientation. So let's try Z+. Let's try Z-. I'm not even sure which one I need, so I'm going to keep guessing and checking. Let's increase this effect. And yeah, now you can see that's pushing downward. So that's definitely what I want, but now we need to perfectly match this linear field based on where the beak fall off is going to be. So selecting that plane or this linear field inside our plane deformer, I can shrink this down further and further and further and move it into what I think is the proper spot. And now you can see this top half of what will become the beak is going to start getting pushed downward. Now you see, I'm not shrinking my linear field down to 0. If we go down to 0, really, really small, you see that everything is getting pushed down uniformly. But I want each point that's further along, traveling up on Y, I want to go the opposite direction more and more. So let's leave that linear field scaled up a little bit more, and now you can see it's falling off as it passes down through it. So let's grab that plane deformer and say, not deform as much. Now you can see as I push this, it's bending more and more and more and more downward. Excellent, that's exactly what I want. We can now move our plane deformer into whatever position we need it to be. So let's grab it here and say, okay, I want to move it up. And then I want the beak to point a little bit forward. So let's hit R and rotate that. And now you can see we could get the beak to start to appear by folding it outward. Now you see it's also affecting the wings. So we need to limit that a little bit more than we currently are. And I think I want to deform that outward a little bit more. Invert that more and more and more. I don't know how far I want to go, but that looks pretty good. Okay, so really simple, add another field. Let's say linear spherical. And that's again created 0. Let's say that's a multiplier on it. T for scale, shrink, 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 shrink. And now I've shrunk it enough that, yeah, it's only applying to the head of the bird. So at that point, I'm not even going to bother doing it because I think you all see where we're going with this. If we were to keyframe this bulge, we have that keyframe out. I guess we'll do it manually here. Let's 0 that out and 0 this out. So now we keyframe this to bulge outward, and then we grab this one and we say, and now that inverts to flip down, and then we grab the original one and say, and now it pinches back in again. So we've now manually done the steps needed by essentially very literally doing what's going to happen here on the origami. So having done that, we can jump to the final version, and that's just dragging the cloth back on top, hit play, and we can get the final folding of the bird. Let that flip, fold, fold, spin around, bulges out, beak folds in, pushes back in. Oh, this is the one I had keyframed for. Let me grab this one and revert. File, revert. Yeah, let me just activate all these. Because if we had time, I have a fancy trick I wanted to show. But yeah, those are all folding in. Keep in mind that, again, this is just our manual keyframes that we're applying to get applied in very specific spots. I think I didn't turn something on, and I should have. But we can art direct any part of this that we want to. We can keep, and in this case I did, I keyframed the bendiness where I want it to be stiff at certain times and I want it to be floppy at others. We could have the bends slowly animated from one side to the other. We can, right now, you can see what the bird looks like, but I can say, you know what? This should be way thinner. I want really tight bends. So we can say 0.01 on the thickness. And now when I hit play, instantly you're gonna see all these pinch inward and become way crisper in the way that they're folding. But we can also say, well, make it 0.1, so 10 times thicker. And now we should see the bird suddenly bulge outward because it wants more space in between all of its different components. So yeah, letting that finish. Yeah, we're not gonna have time to get into the fancy one. So let's close that up and maybe we'll be able to address some of the question, or I might be able to do it in my next Rocket Lasso Live where we really step through things really meticulously. But what are you gonna do when you have a lot you wanna talk about in the presentation? So anyway, I wanted to get really fancy with the last one. And if we look at these folds, it's actually folding an origami cube. So as we scroll down, you can see that we've got this fancy fold right here. Look at this one movement that they do. That's a single movement, all those moving in together. And then you can see it fold after fold after fold after fold, and then finally You flip all the different parts out. And then they skip out over it in the video, which is strange. But there's a little hole that ends up in the tip, and then you blow air into it, and you end up with like this inflated cube. I remember making these in school like way back in the day. So again, we're using all the exact same techniques that we've been doing up to this point. We could go and activate all these steps, and this is just manually looking at folding like 1/4 of it, because you end up doing the same thing like 4 times in a row. I guess we got to talk about. I don't have time. I'm going to go to the final and show you. This is a teaser. I'm going to record a full-on video in the future that's really talking about this. But you start using joints to do that one big giant movement, and it's actually pretty straightforward, the mechanics of it. But eventually you get to layer all these together, and I got a couple additional cool techniques that I look forward to showing. And I'm sure in the future, in live streams, people are going to ask for more advanced origami that we're going to step through and figure out all the different details. But let's just let this one play through, and you can see that these exact same techniques that we've been talking about, and it's all deformation, so you can also deform with the joints. So that's what this one is going to do. And you can see how you just keep adding more complexity. You can see repeating these same bend deformers in one spot and another, flipping it around. Here, I'll even focus on this a little bit, zoom in. You can see that we need to do that bird beak technique that we just did, where these fold over, but we're going to need this flap to fold in this little pocket right there. So exactly the bird beak technique. I'm inflating those outward, pushing them, and then these 2 flaps bend in. Exactly the same technique, just done 4 times here. And then it deflates again, so those get pinched inside the shape. All 4 fold outward, and then via some fancy deformations, we can deform into this final shape there. All the simulation running, nothing intersecting each other, and we get all these crazy final folds. So, yeah, very, very excited for this technique. There's so many cool things that I think people are going to be able to do with it. And the big thing is it's all about art directing things. This has been focused on origami and paper and folding, but if we take a look at this, here's a new swirl capsule that Rocket Lasso made for Maxon. So if you have Maxon 1, you've already got this in your asset browser. And you can see that it is going to create, let me turn these off, it's going to create a cool swirl effect. So you see it's going to be spinning that around. So that's what that deformer does. So it's like, okay, it's cool as a deformer. But then I can add the spherify in, and the spherify is keyframed. So this is just pure deformation. So you can see that that swirl is spinning, the spherify shrinks it down until it's almost nothing. And then, I've got a final smooth going. But now, let's say, hey, let's apply that same mix animation technique on that animation, hit play, and now we're actually having a simulation run where the cloth can't stretch beyond whatever amount we told the simulation to go. And I get this beautiful twisting with like 2 keyframes, and then the whole thing shrinks down and gets into being a crumpled ball instead of nothing, because it all wants to collapse down into one particular spot. So I think that is going to wrap up my presentation. So thank you so much, everybody.